Thich Nhat Hanh, Buddhist teacher, said, people have a hard time letting go of their suffering. Out of fear of the unknown, they prefer suffering that is familiar. And Friedrich Nietzsche said, to live is to suffer. To survive is to find some meaning in that suffering. So Buddhism offers this promise of alleviating suffering in the world. Different translations offer the idea of nirvana, freedom, awareness, and peace out of that freedom of suffering. So how does that happen? So one of the things Buddhism purports is that we are aggregates, compounded in bodies and minds. A classic example of Buddhism on this theory of psychology is that we can take, for example, a table and break it down in its matter. Break it down to a top and 4 legs and the screws holding those legs and table top. And break it down further, you got wood, plastic, and the labor that went into building that table. Break it down further to trees or the petroleum of plastic and the mining of that metal for the screws. All organic and non-organic material is extracted from Earth. We rely on Earth's living organism to produce not just food, but all material that we use in this life. Buddhism says that we can look at our minds and the interconnectedness of everything in a similar fashion. As far as bodies, we're born into these small bodies. With nurturing and food, we develop into adolescents and then adults. This food builds up bone mass, increases blood volume until we reach adulthood, and the alchemy continues until we die. Intermixed with all of this is the mental conditions that we are exposed to in this life. We all have different traumas, sufferings, happinesses, and joys in this life. How we respond to these joys, challenges, and sufferings in life produces different outcomes based on conditioning that we have received throughout our lifetimes. Take, for example, a child who was raised by saying they could never do anything right and exposed maybe to mental abuse. Unless intervention of some kind is engaged in, as adults, this conditioning is likely to continue. Take a similar child with the same economic factors, but the parents spoil the child and they feel entitled to everything, but may get ahead in the economic conditions of life. And yet, take another child in similar circumstances where they are raised in a nurturing household and raised to take care of our earth and family, community, and the underserved in this life. These 3 children who might come out from the exact same neighborhood and went maybe to the same grade school will likely have different emotional lives, at least as children. How they gravitate, their impulses and decisions in life, and how they relate to others may be different. The sufferings will be different, but they all experience suffering in some way. This is the human condition, or so Buddhism says. Freedom, on the other hand, is the release of the automatic habitual wheel, that we experience in life as we build awareness to how things actually are in life and to not get stuck in habitual patterns that don't serve peace or compassion or happiness, and seeing the interconnectedness of this life. We can lead with more awareness and intention to have peaceful lives. And we can still look at what I call the hangover of the pandemic to see where suffering has recently existed, individual and collective traumas for 3 years, and for some, due to their situation and conditions, the pandemic lives on with those who have compromised immune systems, or family members who have compromised immune systems, or still feeling the loss of a loved one. Maybe it's the PTSD of surviving when others didn't. Maybe with unsolved issues, when you hoped there would be more time in this life for those you care about, there just wasn't. Maybe new economic challenges surfaced during this surviving old debts that won't go away. There are other traumas, big and small, that we face by the very nature of being human. We survive them sometimes more easily than at other times. And there's the very real existence of just everyday mean people in everyday life. There are people who harm, as well as the devastating long-term and multiple effects of war. Death of loved ones, we have regrets, mistakes made by ourselves and others who made mistakes. Suffering is baked into the existence of human life. With suffering in this life, some seek spiritual teachings, or in some cases, psychological teachings, to bring meaning to short-term and long-term issues. Without hope, peace, or joy in life, the obstacles carry extra weight in our lives. As Unitarian Universalists, we might seek out varied ways to bring about comfort to our lives and alleviate suffering. I remember as a child, when I got hurt, more important than the Band-Aid in healing was my mother's kiss. But isn't that how it is with everything? Of course, we attend to healing the body when necessary, but we want to be connected, appreciated, loved, listened to, taken care of with compassion. And with that, the rest seems more easily manageable. As a chaplain, the most painful deaths usually were when no one was at the bedside. When dying, lonely deaths are very painful and filled with suffering in their own way. When surrounded by loved ones, sharing how much each meant in their lives, someone in pain might pass with a smile. Mental anguish and suffering is real, particularly in reflection of how a life might have been lived in the very end of this life. So when, as adults, without connection and healing and support, we continue to feel broken and ill, forgotten, or hurt, even while maybe our literal wounds have healed. One reason I love Unitarian Universalism is that we have a pluralistic faith. You can be Christian, Buddhist, humanist, Jewish, pagan, and come together and worship, as the ethical principles in doing so in covenant is more important than individual associated creeds. But at the same time, others with their creeds are welcome into the fold in building and exploring beloved community in our spiritual quests. And because of this, there is no one approach that fits a spiritual direction that one might seek. Some experience in my life that has led me to be a seeker include, at a very young age, I was bullied at school from like K to 12, a Seattle area school. I emerged into the world due to that hesitant, suspect, reserved, and suspicious of some people's intentions, yet at the same time succumbing to those I was suspicious of. It doesn't make much logical sense, but our emotions sometimes seemingly don't have logic to them. I must have been born shy, as each child in this world is unique and have their own tendencies, as infants and toddlers do. I was raised in a stable household, living in the same home from K to 12th grade. There was a main bully in school, at least for me, that would taunt me, who lived down the street from me, and preyed on my weaknesses with his own insecurities. He was very popular, and his opinion mattered to many at school. It was almost like a mission of his to see how unpopular I could be. 12 years of my life, and I could not remove myself from that situation. So the definition of a bully is someone who habitually seeks to harm or intimidate those that they perceive as vulnerable. I begged my parents to change school districts just to start anew, but that apparently had its own problems, including logistically. So I treaded through with few friends as a child. I learned to live independently, I suppose, at a young age. To this day, for better or worse, I like to travel alone. I like to dine alone, albeit now I go and seek out dog-friendly places. My My 20s were spent in the grunge years of the 90s in Seattle. It fit my personality and attitude at the moment, I suppose. Study.com explains grunge's attitude as the grunge subculture was an American movement concerned with social justice that began in the late 80s and became hugely popular in the early 90s. Grunge is often called the Seattle sound. The grunge subculture developed in Seattle, Washington, and is recognized by music lyrics that speak of problems of society and relationships. The style of grunge is long, dirty, messy hair and torn jeans. The musical style of grunge is depressed lyrics sung in screeching vocals. The attitude of grunge subculture is largely one of burnout with society. Often people in the grunge subculture seem cool and indifferent, unquote. So, my suffering coming out of childhood could be summed up in how I gravitated to grunge. When a burnout with society by age 18, looking for a group of people who seemed cool and indifferent, not popular, not too perfect, not too pretty, but the symbolization that came with messy hair and torn jeans. And just like that, I found my people. Iconic grunge lead of the band Nirvana, Kurt Cobain, stated on punk rock music, which was influential in grunge music. He said, "Punk is musical freedom. It's saying, doing and playing what you want. In Webster's terms, nirvana means freedom from pain, suffering, and the external world, and that's pretty close to my definition of punk rock." Cobain had his own sufferings of life that led prematurely to his death, yet he was a searcher in finding meaning in life, which many of his lyrics navigated and why so many people resonated with the angst and his search in the music that was coming out at that time. Around this time in my life, I began to read a lot of spiritual books, including Buddhism, and attended UU churches, as I did my search for meaning and purpose in this world. But I stayed at the surface, I guess you could say. In that same period of my life, in my mid-20s, I found myself working at a camping and rock climbing store during my college and grunge years, working with others who experienced disenfranchisement of the world, and one of those people would soon become my husband. We fell in love, moved to California, where he had access to world-class rock climbing and skiing not too far from Yosemite National Park. We both got interesting nonprofit and government jobs in this rural community that we were living in. Our lives had a different emphasis once we moved, and we spent more time apart, him literally taking a month at a time in the backwoods going solo, and my vacations going elsewhere during that time. After coming back home one time, he asked for divorce. I was still deeply in love and anguished at what was to come. In hindsight, it all made sense, but it didn't for me then. And after a year of separation, I came to realize that it was just never going to work out because I couldn't make a person do what I wanted them to do with much success for various reasons. Then I got a job as an accounting controller at a local or a chain furniture store in southern Nevada as I went through that divorce. I got the job through a temp placement service. The owner said that since I didn't walk away out of the chaos in the 3 months that I was there, he was going to offer me a permanent position. I wish I had walked away, because chaos was exactly what it was. The spouse of the primary owner had a gambling problem and stole from the company, along with other family members that were dysfunctional with each other, and a family that had daily shouting matches at the family-run business. And then a company bought them, which sneakily planned to finish gutting out companies that they bought, all while they got a profit in planned bankruptcy, unbeknownst to the family that agreed in co-management. I stayed on as their accounting controller with a good raise, which brought an expectation that I would engage in more high-pressured situations. I was told to sign documents that I knew I should be but the bully managers demanded that I signed before I could clock out for the day. So back to the patterns of being bullied. I caved, I sulked, and did what I was told in unrealistic hopes that succumbing would get me approvals and being liked more by them. After a year of leaving, once the company did indeed go bankrupt, I got collection notices with these notices saying that because I was an owner, I had a personal financial responsibility. I asked to see these documents one by one, and there were quite a few of them. It was my signature, but the title had been altered from controller to owner. I consulted 4 attorneys, and they all said the same thing: I was screwed. Companies could pursue me for funds, and I could pursue the forgers in separate cases. It wrecked me financially for at least 10 years to follow. The buildup of patterns, year after year, were not getting me where I had hoped to get in this life. I went back to Seattle and then began meditating daily for a year. While there, I got laid off from an okay job, but it was in the recession of the 08-09 years. And a fellow meditator said, "Hey, we have a center in Colorado. Why don't you check it out and see if they need an accountant?" I did, and they did need an accountant. That was the beginning of living at Buddhist centers for about 5 years, with its own challenges and suffering. Those stories are for another time, but as with any faith or institution, not all are equal. Not all are good at producing good karma. It took me 5 years to find a Buddhist teacher in a center I was happy with, and 12 years later, after finding one that I like, I still feel nurtured by this group, and it's not the one that I found in Colorado. So those are a few examples of my life. We all have our own unique series of suffering, of experiences in this life. And before and after these stories that I shared, there are other stories of loss and suffering, including my best friend, Lakita, who lived in South America when diagnosed with cancer and not living 3 months after that diagnosis. And I wasn't able to contact her, or even before she died, or even knew she was dying until after. I was never able to say goodbye to her. And that one still haunts me. A path to alleviating suffering doesn't mean that you don't love or you don't cry anymore. You just do it with awareness and compassion. Nirvana isn't some blissed out state of mind. It's just free from the chains that bind us to our suffering. For me, I chose to delve deep into Buddhism around this time, wondering what the Buddha understood about suffering and the path to alleviate suffering. Not everyone has the same traumas, obstacles, and sufferings of this life. Yet suffering is a common denominator in life. We navigate suffering individually and collectively, and we can follow a pathway that leads away from suffering towards peace. What I appreciate about Buddhism is that a core teaching of Buddhism is what is known as Four Noble Truths, that suffering exists and the way out of our suffering can be taught in the teachings of what they call the Eightfold Path. And so just briefly, that Eightfold Path is to live with right understanding, right intent, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness. That of being aware of the current moment that allows us to break negative habitual thoughts or actions. And then the eighth, right concentration. The Eightfold Path has instructions for each of these efforts, which I won't go into detail here today, although I do want to mention briefly that there are also teachings of what they call the 8 consciousnesses, which are our 5 senses, our mental formation of those 5 senses, our consciousness based on those senses, which is the 7th, and then the 8th is what they call the storehouse consciousness. And according to at least Tibetan Buddhist teachings, there's this 8th storehouse consciousness. Consciousness in general is the discernible feelings or emotions, perceptions, and those mental formations, the five senses that build up patterns in how we think and act in life. Living as humans, we have common experiences of being human, but our individual lives have different manifestations. We all have thoughts, with some of us gravitating to some over other thoughts of varying intensities. We then grasp onto these thoughts as if they have significant meaning, and maybe some of those thoughts do have meaning when it comes to survival and love. But sometimes these thoughts build up to emotions, and the emotions increase through activity. Maybe emotions of anger build, and then sometimes those thoughts and emotions of anger build up to destructive actions or words, whether towards oneself or others. For much of my life, I believed the words of the bullies and the mean bosses, always to appease their hurt and anger, not realizing that I was the punching bag for their sorrows, trauma, and anger. So we all have different experiences or karma. Some are born into wealth, some are born into poverty, and we don't know why. Some are born into having nurturing parents, and some aren't, and we just never know why. Some experience the horrific action of rape in this life, and others not, and we might never know why. Some are targets for this atrocious act, and why others aren't. Some are engaged in happy marriages, and some aren't. Some are lucky to get great bosses and good employment opportunities, while some struggle to get that. Some bear healthy children and are happy parents. Some have more challenging experience, whether they are able to bear children at all. Some are victims of crime, while others go their whole lives not experiencing significant crime in their lives. Some experience death too early, while others live long, healthy lives. Sometimes we think that life is about obtaining this picture-perfect life free from suffering. But the Buddha's first actions towards his enlightenment were going into the world of suffering, outside his protected and privileged palace walls. He was a prince, and he had well-intentioned parents who wanted to protect him from the suffering of this world and the lower castes of society as Buddhism grew out of Hinduism. But the Buddha, once exposed to suffering of the everyday world that included poverty, in his rebellious acts of leaving the palace walls on his own, saw that it wasn't right or virtuous to have so much suffering in the world while he had the privilege of not being able to do so. He saw his privilege in the interconnected reality of the world. So in all my personal suffering, I reached out to Buddhist teachings for understanding through the Buddha's lens what this suffering was all about. Buddhism isn't about saying, well, you have your privileged life, and I have my privileged life and others don't, so forget about your first world problems. It's about acknowledging that we all have suffering in this life, that there is a path forward to alleviating mental and existential suffering in this life and through the Eightfold Path, seeing how our minds function and grasp onto things that might not necessarily alleviate our suffering, to see that others suffer along with us in a myriad of ways, and that we are interconnected in this life. Famed 21st century Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron writes, "The next time you lose heart and you can't bear to experience what you're feeling, you might recall this instruction. Change the way you see it and lean in. Instead of blaming our discomfort on outer circumstances or on our own weaknesses, we can choose to stay present and awake to our experience, not rejecting it, not grasping it, not buying the stories that we relentlessly tell ourselves. This is priceless advice that addresses the true causes of suffering, yours, mine, and that of all living beings." so we can be with the suffering and be a friend to our sufferings. We bring compassion to the thoughts and situation at hand. One can bring grace and hope to oneself as we navigate the suffering of our lives, the small and the big stuff. And if we can touch that process to know what it feels like, we can be more compassionate to others who suffer as well. We can meditate and we can wish for more peaceful lives that aren't necessarily tied to material comforts. And we can wish to break habits of actions that produce ongoing harm to self and others in varying degrees. And we can wish for peace for self and others. But it helps if we can pursue more reflectively and objectively how we individually engage in this world and ourselves, with each person having their own path. For some, it might be prayer. For some, it might be meditation. For some, it might be psychotherapy. And for some, it might be confiding in a friend and asking for forgiveness, or maybe engaging in support groups. You just need to find what works for you. If we find that we can be more compassionate to ourselves, that don't perpetuate harm or angst to ourselves, maybe we can navigate that process better in how we relate to others in this life, in our interconnected lives with each other and the world. May it be so, and amen.
Amen.
So we will extinguish our chalice here, that it might glow gently in our hearts. May it light your path as you leave this place. May it guide your way until we are together again. And my closing words for you are from Nelson Mandela. He says, "Our human compassion binds us from one to the other, not in pity or patronizingly, but as human beings who have learned how to turn our common suffering into hope for the future." Amen. And now we sing our closing hymn, number 17.